Hello, I'm Ollie. This is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror, I've got two 80s British horror novels for your entertainment. Now, being of a certain age and having grown up in the 80s, so, my 80s were definitely my formative years from a reading and movie-going perspective. I love British horror novels from the 80s. And I think, the kings of that form, and I'm not saying these guys are the best British horror writers by any means, but I think the kings of 80s British horror are James Herbert and Sean Hudson. And for both of them, their first book was a creature feature. So The Rats for Herbert and Slugs for Sean Hudson. And those books for me, those two books in particular, really epitomise what 80s British horror is about, in that they are fantastically violent, simplistically plotted, but hugely entertaining and extremely gory. And as I've said in other videos, I personally think that the boom in British horror fiction in the 70s and definitely the 80s as well was largely down to the film censorship laws over here. So unlike in the States, where basically any film can get released, it just may not carry a rating, which may limit where it can be shown. In the UK, there was and still is an absolute ceiling, if you like, and there are some films that would just never been publicly released over here as a result of that. So that was true in the 70s, and there were horror movies that were not released over here at all, or were released in heavily censored versions, and it became even more of a big deal in the 1980s when home video started, and over here that led to what's referred to as the video nasty panic, where essentially films that would not have received permission to be released at the cinema through a legal loophole were able to be released on home video. So there were lots of scare stories in the newspapers about 5-year-old kids watching I Spit on Your Grave and things like that, which I think were probably an element of truth in them. And I certainly remember I was 10 when I was 10 in 83, which is kind of when that video nasty scare was. And I certainly remember kids I went to school with claiming, I don't know if they had or not, but claiming to have seen I Spit on Your Grave and Zombie Flesh Eaters. Now, Zombie Flesh Eaters, I think, actually is probably fine. It's such a silly film. But yeah, I Spit on Your Grave, I would probably not allow a 10-year-old to watch. Anyway, so my personal view is that boosted, if you like, British horror fiction, because the same kind of restrictions were not in place for books, and what that led to was a lot of paperbacks cheaply published with lurid covers, such as this one for Scorpion Second Generation, that turned up on the bookshelves to satiate the public's appetite for that kind of thing, particularly after the video nasty scare, when a lot of videos that people might otherwise have watched disappeared off the shelves. So recently I've read a couple of books from that period. So Swamp by Peter Tremayne, which I think was from 1985, and Scorpion's Second Generation by Michael A Linaker from 1982. And I wanted to talk about these. And I think between them, these two books could have been really good, but they both get a pretty fundamental thing wrong. So I'll talk a little bit about the plots, and then I'll talk about what they do right and what they don't do right. So Swamp, first of all, Swamp with an exclamation mark, it must be said, because it needs an exclamation mark. So this is set in the Florida Everglades, and it's an Everglades that has been invaded by kind of mutant lizard people kind of characters, or at least one of them, who attack the local wildlife and eventually local people as well. So there's a few different characters in this. There's like someone who does like tour, like a tour guide who takes people out on boats through the Everglades, and there's also a couple of Cuban refugees who are on the run from the authorities. What this book does really well is basic storytelling. It's actually got a number of different threads. So you've got, as I say, you've got these Cuban characters, you've got the tour guide who's, kind of trying to make a living, you've got other characters as well. And actually the characters are, they're not fantastically drawn, but they are interesting enough that they keep you reading and you kind of want to know what's going to happen to them. So the plot moves along at a pretty decent clip, and there are, a good number of scenes where, the monster attacks, and either, fishermen or sightseers or whatever get taken by the creature. What this book does badly, where it falls down, is there's just no sex or violence in it. It's incredibly tame, and the whole thing reads a lot like a 50s monster movie, in that you kind of get this build up and the drama, but then when something happens, like you cut to the next scene. So it's really disappointing from that respect. It's like Peter Tremaine didn't get the memo that James Herbert and Sean Hudson got, that the way to sell books was to make them as explicit as possible. And I'm almost tempted to say he should rewrite this book. So I believe he's still writing, albeit under a different name now. He should rewrite this book and add more sex and violence, and I think it would be fantastic. As it is, you're constantly left wanting more, and not in a good way. You're constantly left unsatisfied by the book. So it's quite well written and quite entertaining, but it just doesn't really deliver. The other thing I've got to say is it's got this terribly cheesy ending as well. Like the real we were the real monster. It's got that kind of ending to it. That was a bit much as well. But again, very much in the vein of those 50s monster movies. Scorpion Second Generation, on the other hand, is fantastically gory, and the gore scenes are brilliant. There's one set piece in particular. So okay, what's it about? It's about giant scorpions. It might look on the cover, it kind of looks on the cover like the scorpions are really big, but they're not. They're kind of the size of a Labrador. They're that sort of size. So you certainly wouldn't want to encounter one, but they're not like 50s style giant scorpions. So the gore scenes and the horror scenes are really pretty good at this. There's one bit in particular where there's like a circus that's come to the part of the UK where these scorpions are, and the scorpions attack both the people who are visiting the circus, and also like the animals, so like the lions get out and stuff like that as well. So it's complete carnage and very entertaining. What's lacking in this book is the complete opposite of what's lacking in Swamp, is that there's just not really a story. So there's a couple of guys who are investigating the mysterious killings. So one of whom is a cop and one of whom is like a scientist. They never really talk to each other. There's never any tension really about what they're doing, and they just kind of bumble through the book. And at the end, they kind of figure out how to save people, but then inevitably something happens at the end that leaves things open for a sequel. The gore scenes in this were really good, apart from the fact that I swear in every single time when someone gets attacked, Linaker uses the word pulpy. So obviously pulpy is a word I use quite a lot in my videos in reference to books, and this is definitely a pulpy book, but he uses it in reference to wounds. So people have pulpy wounds where they get attacked by the scorpions. That wore thin a bit after a while. But apart from that, the violence is good, but the story's crap and the characters are completely wooden and boring. Whereas in Swamp, violence is boring, everything else is pretty good. So as I say, I think if they collaborated, if you took the violence from this and the story from this, you'd have a really good British horror novel from the 80s, which would stand up against the Kings, Herbert and Hudson. As it is, both of them were pretty disappointing. So let me know in the comments if you've read either of these books or other books by the same authors. Tremaine, I think, wrote a few things. I've read his book Ants, which was also quite disappointing. Linaker, I think, only wrote, there's another Scorpion book which I haven't been able to get hold of, and he wrote another one which I did used to have a paperback copy of when I was a kid, but I don't think I ever read it, which was called The Touch of Hell, which I seem to remember had a guy in fire on the cover. Let me know if you've read any of their books, but also let me know what's your favourite 80s British horror novel. I'd be interested to see what people out there like. As always, hope you're safe and well. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will speak to you again soon.